we're
again. So we'll need to mute the speakers.
The input level isn't coming through.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is that we're going to keep this laptop here because they can hear us through here. And then, okay. All right, and this one is on. And I don't hear any music anymore. Okay. So, sorry about that, everyone. Good morning. Luckily, my opening remarks can be short. Thank you so much for making it out here in this rain, which has rained in our parade, but you know, rain is barakah. So my name is Karjoo-Ravary. I'm a professor here in the history department at Columbia University. This conference has luckily come together after more than a year of planning. We've titled it Translated Desire, Translation, Ibn al-ʿArabi and the Multilingual Islamic Past. It came together first after my colleagues, Dr. Mohammed Rustom and Dr. Oludumini Ogunaike and the board of the Muhyiddin Ibn al-ʿArabi Society approached me about holding a symposium on Ibn al-ʿArabi at Columbia right before I actually started at Columbia. But originally we hoped to time this with the wonderful festschrift that was recently published for Professors William C. Chittick and Professor Sachiko Murata, which is titled Islamic Thought and the Art of Translation. But the pandemic unfortunately got in the way. But as we still wanted to do something for the professors, we kept the theme of the festschrift and invited participants from its many contributors to come together here today to talk about the works and influence of the Shaykh al-Akbar Ibn al-ʿArabi. Once I arrived at Columbia and found out that the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, translated as the Translative Desires, is taught to every freshman in Columbia through the core curriculum, I realized that this would be an important theme and contribution to the intellectual community here. And also, to absolutely no one's surprise, Columbia professors have a very difficult time teaching the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq in general, let alone to freshmen. So, you know, it's part of our hope that this will be a resource for them to approach the works of Ibn al-ʿArabi. And so even though while the event did not end up being about the festschrift directly, its presence is still palpable, even physically, as we brought it in the back for all of you to see. Mohammed Rustom has been kind enough to bring a copy, which he'll donate to Columbia University, but please take a look at it. Now, for this conference, we obviously conceptualized translation very broadly, keeping in mind the wide scope of the term tarjuman itself and tarjama in Arabic. And as some of you saw yesterday, and I hope you still had a restful night after all of that, we wanted to leave room for contemplating how the tarjuman speaks in a wide variety of perspectives and media, so arts, music, and other things. And it's my hope that this event not only opens up new doors on this important aspect of Islamic intellectual history, but also helps translate the writing and work of Ibn al-ʿArabi for those who still have not been able to access him. And so lastly, before I give up the floor, I need to thank our many supporters. This conference was possible through the generous support of many people, organizations, and institutions. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank the Middle East Institute, Astrid and Benedict, who I think is somewhere here, who did so much hard work. There she is. Just to bring all of this together, all the logistical work yesterday and today, and the MEI student workers, Sophia Leathers and Dalia Atallah, who is also back there. Sophie is here. Really, they've done so much. I would also like to thank the Muhyiddin Ibn al-ʿArabi Society, another major donor, and particularly Maren Gleason, Jane Carroll, and Halide Hassan, who is also there. She is. Oh, and Maren is there too. Another special thank you to the History Department, the director of its business office, Lawina Lurum, our business manager, Rasha Aldain, Samantha Feng, Michael Aiden, Theo Cutler, and all our staff in the office who have dealt with navigating this logistical maze. My colleague and mentor in the History Department, Dr. Manan Ahmed, deserves a hearty thanks for helping me push through some of the most difficult parts of this organization and for the support of his Qalam for Pakistan initiative. The Center for the Core Curriculum, Dean Larry Jackson and Dr. Joseph Howley contributed immensely to this event, and hope along with me that it will help Columbia professors teach Ibn al-ʿArabi in the future. The Heyman Society of Fellows also contributed generously. Its director, Dr. Aidin Galuli, helped me navigate the vast landscape of Columbia to bring all this together. And I'd also like to thank Professor Bernard Harcourt and the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, who have allowed us to use their space for this conference. So also, just now I'm going to start listing people. So Julian Bennett Holmes and the Sacred Music Series, the Computer Music Center and its director, Seth Pruitt, Char Prahar, the Sakip Sabanci Center for Turkish Studies, Professor Catherine Spellman-Poots and the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, Courtney Chartier and the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, New York Islamic Arts, and the Pakistani Students Association, who were helping us yesterday with ushering. And I'd, of course, also would like to thank all of our presenters for graciously accepting our invitation, to Professor Chidik and Marada for risking a great deal to join us, hopefully in the afternoon. We're just trying to really maximize their safety and everyone else's safety. As you all know, COVID is going around. So we have high quality masks, and we do ask that you consider masking, especially once they come. And also to those who agreed to be our chairs. So Jane Carroll of the Muhyiddin Ibn al-ʿArabi Society, and my colleagues here at Columbia, Dr. Elaine Van Dalen and Dr. Sarah Bentayer, who'll be chairing the other panels. Thanks to all of you for really making this happen. Thank you so much. So we'll start with our first panel.
Thank you. My name is Jane Carroll from the Ibn al-ʿArabi Society, and on behalf of the Society, I'd like to sincerely thank Ali and everyone at Columbia is in touching presence here. It's been a long work for years. Just on a point, I'd like to say that our keynote speaker, Professor Chitik, also honoured the Ibn al-ʿArabi Society at its first symposium in Oxford in 1987. So it's amazing to come around again. We have three speakers. I will introduce them all at the beginning. They will each talk and then we'll hold questions until the end. The first speaker, to my right, Marlene Dubois, is Professor of English at the State University of New York at Suffolk County Community College. Her research interests are in comparative religions, Sufism, and mythic narrative. She holds a PhD in comparative studies in religion from Stony Brook University, where she worked with Professor Chitik and Marada. She, as all the speakers, will actually contribute to the lecture on display at the top there. Maria Dakake is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at George Mason University. She was a contributor and general editor with others, including Mohammed Rustom, to the Study Qur'an, a new translation and a commentary, and also the Routledge Companion to the Qur'an. She also narrated the life and legacy of Muhammad to the great courses on Audible. Mohammed Rustom is Professor of Islamic Thought and Global Philosophy at Carleton University and the Director of the Carleton Center for the Study of Islam. He is the author of The Triumph of Mercy, Philosophy and Scripture in Mullah Sadra, and his more recent books include The Essence of Reality, A Defense of Philosophical Sufism, and is editor of the Christian Global Philosophy Sourcebook. He's also the editor of the History. I'd like to start with Marlene Dubois, and the title of her talk is The Covenant of Allah, When Love Shares Its Promise. Thank you.
From here.
Many of you are familiar with the well-known Hadith Qudsi, or divine saying, the Hadith of the Hidden Treasure. The Prophet quotes God as saying, "I was a hidden treasure, and I love to be known, so I created the creatures." It would be fair to say that the impression of Islam as a religion of love comes from this Hadith. Henri Corbin, one of the early Ibn Arabi scholars in the West, described his impression of Ibn Arabi's view on God by making reference to this hadith. Quote, a divine being alone in his unconditioned essence, of which we only know one thing, precisely the sadness of the primordial solitude that makes him yearn to be revealed in beings who manifest him to himself. Perhaps the sadness is speculative, but it's intriguing to consider. I don't know. Regardless, scholars have maintained that Ibn Arabi's entire metaphysical vision is deeply rooted in the Hadith Qudsi of the hidden treasure. I would like to give some perspectives on how this love pervades explications of the covenant of Alast in particular, both before Ibn Arabi and after him. So, what is the covenant of Alast? Most scholars refer to it as an event that takes place before time began. According to the Quran, before God molded the clay of Adam, his first words to his creatures were the words of the covenant, Alastu Barabikum, am I not your Lord? They answered, or we answered, yes, we testify. The full text reads, and when thy Lord took from the children of Adam, from their loins, their progeny, and made them bear witness concerning themselves, am I not your Lord? They said, yea, we bear witness. And the text continues, lest you should say on the day of resurrection, truly of this we were heedless. The importance of the verse has been characterized by scholars as the cornerstone of Islamic sacred history, and the idea that has impressed Muslims more than any other idea. At the same time, it has been noted that scholarship on the covenant of Alast and its place within the tradition is lacking as compared to the breadth of scholarship on the covenants in Judaism and Christianity. My aim today is to demonstrate how Ibn Arabi and those in his school of thought, like the Sufis before them, thought of the covenant of Alast as a promise of love. I'll start by giving you a taste of the covenant in literary and religious consciousness. For one, the Persian poets often refer to the covenant of Alast as the banquet of Alast. As in this passage from 12th century Ahmed Samani, on the day of Am I Not Your Lord, a table of love was set up. By the decree of gentleness, you were sat down at the table and given a lawful morsel from the covenant of Lordhood's majesty. With the hand of yes, indeed, you placed that morsel in love's mouth. Samani and others, for example, Rusbahan Bakli, also describe Sama, audition, or the sense of hearing, as linked to the covenant. Rusbahan says, for example, that the Sufis' ritual practice of Sama originated on the day of the covenant. So when he uses the word, he's often alluding to the covenant. Rusbahan, Qadat, and others have also cited the day of the covenant as the day that God first revealed his beauty, causing love to appear, so that those advanced on the spiritual path may experience beauty in this world as a reminder of the beauty of God on that day. In addition, music is also cited as something triggering the memory of the day of the covenant. It is reported that the 10th century Junaid was asked, why is a man usually quiet, but becomes agitated when he hears music? He answered, God addressed the souls during the primordial pact, saying, am I not your Lord? They answered, yes, we testify. And the spirits fully absorbed the sound of these words. So whenever they listen to music, the remembrance of that original act of hearing agitates them. There are potentially many other examples. One researcher has claimed recently there's hardly any classical Sufi poem in any Islamic language that does not invoke the primordial love story of the covenant embedded in the Quranic account of humanity's pre-cosmic existence. So the authors I've mentioned so far preceded the 13th century Ibn Arabi, and our question now is whether or not Ibn Arabi and others of his school spoke of the covenant in a similar fashion. We can begin with Ibn Arabi himself, as we find a mention of the covenant in his major text, the Futuhat. Here he draws a parallel between the pain of love and the covenant. The subtlest thing, he says, the subtlest thing that you may find in love is an excessive passion, a longing, an agitated yearning, a passion, a wasting away, and an inability to sleep or to take pleasure in food, all the while that you do not know who it is or how it is that you love, and your beloved does not become specified for you. This is similar to the covenant made with the children of Adam, that he is our Lord, so that no one can deny it afterwards. Hence, you find in the original nature, the fitra, of every human being, a poverty and a need toward an existent thing that can support him, and that is God. But he's not aware of him. Sayyid-ud-Din Farghani, a student of Ibn Arabi's foremost student, Sadruddin Qunwi, identifies the place of the covenant. And Farghani is 2 steps removed from Ibn Arabi, note that. In his commentary on a poem by Ibn al-Farid, the Tayyah, the poem of the way, in it he addresses the hadith of the hidden treasure as the key to understanding the place of the human being. I was a hidden treasure, and I love to be recognized. Arafah. So I created the creatures so that I would be recognized. He describes the gradual unfolding of love, descending through stages and levels. It is a story in 2 parts. Part 1 is a descent of love into the world of creation. And part 2 is the human being's participation in a returning ascent. And this will be familiar to some of you familiar with Ibn Arabi. So the first half of the story of love is the dissemination of the divine names in all the levels. The descending arc, Nuzuli, the ascending arc, Suudi, is when the human being becomes involved in love-seeking, striving to recognize God through all his names and attributes, fulfilling God's expressed desire in the Hadith. I love to be recognized, so I created the creatures so that I could be recognized. And this is the important part. For Farghani, the descending arc begins with the covenant of Alast, where God and human beings affirm the relationship between themselves, and creation begins. The ascending arc ends with the actualization of the perfect human being who recognizes God through all his names and attributes. There's another poem by Ibn al-Farid that was used to transmit teachings in the school of Ibn Arabi, the Khamriya, or the wine ode. There's general agreement among the commentators that the subject is the wine that was shared on the day of the covenant. The beginning of the poem reads, "We drank wine in the remembrance of the beloved. We were drunk with it before the vine was created." One more time. "We drank wine in the remembrance of the beloved. We were drunk with it before the vine was created." One of the commentators of Ibn Arabi's school, Dawood Qaisari, says of the wine, "One who never knew it is moved by its memory." That is, one who never knew of the wine or the drinking of it is moved by mention of it during the audition session, Sama. Again, referring to the Sufi practice of Sama as was mentioned by Sufis in the earlier period before Ibn Arabi. Interestingly, the wine ode alludes to a group of people who were together on the day of the covenant and who remember. The 15th century Jami, also of Ibn Arabi's school, in his Lawame, or Sparks, writes that he saw this group of people himself. And here his verses are addressed to God. This is Jami. "I am alone. I am not alone in worshiping the wine of your love. Who has been delivered from this wine? Tell me yourself. On the day I took this wine in hand, there they were, the wine worshippers of Alast." Jami describes his experience of the covenant as drinking from the, quote, paradisial cup of recognition, marifa, and the heavenly wine of love and affection. And this is Jami again. Your love, addressing God, your love brought me to this dwelling without head or root to renew the ancient covenant. It poured into my mouth a cup from the vat of proximity. I became tipsy, my tongue loosened to speak. I'll conclude by saying that within the Sufi tradition in general, and likewise with Ibn Arabi and these representatives of his school, God's address to human beings in the covenant shows a movement of divine love, inclining toward the human being. For those who incline in return, it causes the memory of that day to emerge. It is as if the hidden treasure, who loved to be known, created the one who could know him, and then lovingly drew out this slow period of recognition over a lifetime so that it could be savored like a morsel of food, music, or the wine that the poets have described. This intimate relationship between the creator and his creation is reflected in some verses from Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam, the Ringstones of Wisdom, from the Ringstone of Ishmael, where he mentions God's address to human beings at the covenant. Thou art slave, and thou art the Lord of whom thou art slave. And thou art Lord, and thou art the slave of him who hath a promise in his address. I'll read it one more time. Thou art slave, and thou art the Lord of whom thou art slave. And thou art Lord, and thou art the slave of him who hath a promise in his address. It is here that the words of, am I not your Lord, become tender, a promise of love from the Creator.
Our next speaker is Maria Dakake, and she is talking at Karjoo and Ishara, the meaning and stand in Ibn Arabi's approach to the Quran.
I was trying to find my PowerPoint. Oh, is this it? I see it. Okay. Is it good? Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I want to thank Ali for arranging this and for making it just so wonderful. I had so much fun last night that I almost forgot I had a paper to give this morning. So hopefully you can bear with me. The conference is about translation. I'll be talking about ta'wil, which is interpretation, also ishara. But I think in the spirit of the broad understanding of translation, all translation of the Qur'an is an interpretation. So in a sense, hopefully I can say interpretation is also a kind of translation. So let me first of all say, by way of a caveat, that I'm not primarily a scholar of Ibn Arabi in particular. And so I've been quite interested in his thought for a long time. So I'm not going to be presenting necessarily something new about Ibn Arabi. What I hope to do in this presentation is to think with Ibn Arabi about a topic that is of great interest to me, namely the way in which Muslims past and present have tried to understand and interpret the Qur'an, a scripture that presents a number of difficulties and challenges for human understanding, but also, more importantly and less negatively, seems to open doors to profound spiritual meanings, and whose verses often seem to invite interpretation, encouraging us to read and contemplate them over and over again, seeming to promise us access to something deeper, something hidden beneath its literal words. Now, Muslim debates about interpreting the Quran often turn on questions of authority. Who has the authority to interpret the Quran? What qualifications do you need? How much knowledge? What kind of intellectual capacity? Your moral rectitude, and so on. But this question doesn't really interest me that much, in part because even the most knowledgeable human being, even the most intelligent human being, even the most morally upstanding human being is still, in the end, a human being. And the question is, what business does a human being have claiming to know what God really meant in this verse or that verse of the Quran? And at first glance, it would seem that it would seem that the Quran agrees. No, is there a problem?
Excuse me, we're just going to share this to those people on the
sure.
webinar.
Of course, yeah.
Sorry. Thank you so much. Oops, sorry. Yeah. Mhm.
Great, thank you. So this well-known verse at the beginning of Surah Ali Imran, he it is who has sent down the book upon you. Therein are signs determined. They are the mother of the book, and others symbolic. And others symbolic. As for those whose hearts are given to swerving, they follow that of it which is symbolic, seeking temptation, fitna, and seeking its interpretation, ta'wil. And none knows its interpretation, ta'wil, save God and those firmly rooted in knowledge. They say, we believe in it, all of it is from our Lord, and none remember, save those who possess intellect. This verse has long given Muslims pause about the possibility, legitimacy, or even the moral acceptability of seeking to interpret the Quran. And the stakes were raised even more by a well-known hadith that promised a seat in hellfire to anybody who attempted to interpret the Quran according to their own opinion, tafsir bil-ra'i. But even apart from these scriptural or hadith statements warning about interpreting the Quran, as I noted at the outset, one can make a perfectly rational argument based on a belief in God's absolute transcendence and infinitude and the limitations of the human mind, that the idea of human beings making authoritative claims about God's revealed word seems unwise, imprudent, and indeed a demonstration of the kind of hubris that the Quran repeatedly chastises the unbelievers for. And Ibn al-ʿArabi, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, seems to agree. And surprisingly, because as many of you know, Ibn al-ʿArabi's entire corpus of writing could be considered something of a grand commentary on the Quran. It's deeply rooted in the Quran, and he offers a number of unique and sometimes unexpected interpretations of the Word of God, and that might be an understatement. Even so, Ibn al-ʿArabi himself quite adamantly rejects the idea that the human mind and its imperfect rational faculties can make any definitive interpretation of the Word of God. To try to do so for him would be bad manners, su'ul adab toward God, in the nicest possible scenario, and maybe even unbelief. So, this fact, this seeming contradiction has already been well documented and noted by Professor William Chittick, Michael Choikovitz, and other scholars. But I think it's important to try to think a bit more about the term ta'wil, which Ibn al-ʿArabi generally derides, and also ishara, or allusion, which is his term of choice for his own approach to understanding the Quran. So in terms of the word ta'wil itself, of course, the most common well-known word for interpretation of the Quran is tafsir, which usually refers to a kind of general practice interpreting the Qur'an according to its etymology, its grammatical structures, translated understandings of the asbab nuzul, the situation under which various verses were revealed, and early Muslim opinions about this. By at least the 10th century, the term ta'wil which seems initially to have been used kind of interchangeably with tafsir in the very beginning of exegetical work in the Islamic world, the word ta'wil by the 10th century seems to have become somewhat separate to refer more commonly to esoteric or inward or symbolic or allegorical interpretations of the Qur'an, but in different ways. Okay, so what I want to do is talk about sort of three uses, and it looks kind of funny on here. I don't know if you guys can see that. It looks like it's partly covered by this. Should I close this now? Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So just very quickly, not to take too much time, she ta'wil, which, as far as I know, Ibn al-ʿArabi doesn't say a lot about, might be one of the earliest uses, specialized uses of this term. She ta'wil is often juxtaposed with the idea of tanzil, right? So tanzil is the descent of the word, so it has to do with the literal word. Ta'wil its literal meaning, of course, is to return something to its origin, right? To go back to its original purpose, which is how it gets connected with the idea of interpretation. Now, she ta'wil is, first of all, a very allegorical kind of ta'wil. So she's tended to read certain passages of the Qur'an as references to specific historical persons, the Imams, Ali, Fatima, to certain events in history. And this is true in both Twelver and Ismaili. She ta'wil. There's a kind of reading of the Qur'an in light of a history, a kind of broader sacred history of which the Shi Imams, again, whether Ismaili or Twelver, were a central and culminating part of that history. Okay. So obviously, Ibn al-ʻArabi would not have been very happy about this. First of all, because it is a very allegorical type of commentary, one that takes the meaning, the literal meaning, or let's say the assigned meaning of a particular Quranic verse quite far from its literal meaning. And of course, for Shis, the people who really had the responsibility and the ability to interpret the Qur'an was the Imams, right? The prophets bring the tanzil, they bring the revealed word, the Shi Imams bring or unfold the ta'wil over time. Okay. A second kind of ta'wil is a metaphorical interpretation of certain Quranic words or passages that was done by Mu'tazilis and also by later Asharis. And this particularly was done with regard to anthropomorphic expressions in the Qur'an. Right? So if God was said to have a hand or a face or to sit on a throne and so on, it was understood that, you know, reason could not accept the idea that God had a body, was delimited, could have something that looks like flesh, like ours, could sit in one place. And so because this couldn't be accepted from a rational point of view, or I should say a rational point of view based upon a pre-existing belief in God's absoluteness, his inability to be delimited by space and time, because that was an impossibility, you had to interpret it. The hand had to mean his power, or the face had to mean his presence, or sitting on the throne had to mean his absolute authority, and so on. And one of the earliest people to kind of formulate this was Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who wrote a treatise called Qanun al-Ta'wil, the principle of Ta'wil. And it was then, of course, expanded by Fakhruddin Razi, who talks about this in his commentary itself. Interestingly, one of the people who really embraced this idea of the principle of ta'wil, and I should just say that Qanun ta'wil, which I have up there, means you must interpret metaphorically a passage of the Qur'an that contradicts reason like this. One of the people who embraces this is, of course, Ibn Rushd. Not generally a fan of Ghazali in certain ways, but in his Fasl al-Maqal, he really embraces this idea as a rationalist. He embraces this idea of Qanun al-Ta'wil. One of the people who, along with Ibn Arabi, doesn't agree with this is actually Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah spends a long time talking about the problem with Qanun al-Ta'wil. So Ta'wil makes for some strange bedfellows. Finally, I will say, in terms, the Sufis themselves, of course, use the term ta'wil to mean, in general, a kind of deeper or higher or more profound understanding of the Qur'an, which one reaches by going through the literal interpretation of the text. It's not an allegorical idea of sort of leaving the literal meaning of the text, right? It's often understood as either a deeper, as I said, a deeper or a higher meaning. I have this image of the tree here along a kind of vertical axis, right? And both the roots in the ground and the branches up above are connected to each other through the trunk, and they're both mutually dependent upon one another. So it makes sense that a kind of interpretation of the Qur'an that Sufis, including Ibn Arabi, would be happy with would be one in which there is this connection between the outward and the inward aspects of Scripture. Jumping around to save time. Okay, so despite this, for Ibn Arabi, even though the term ta'wil can be used in this way that doesn't necessarily let go of that meaning, of that literal meaning, he still rejects the use of this term ta'wil. And as I said, this notion of a kind of deeper or higher or more profound meaning seems to suggest a range of meaning along a vertical axis. But for Ibn Arabi, who describes the Qur'an as an ocean, it is not just an ocean of unrealizable or unfathomable depth, right, along that vertical axis, but it is also, as Choitkevitz reminds us, for Ibn Arabi, the Qur'an is an ocean without shore. Not just that it's unfathomable in terms of a deep sense, but horizontally, right? It is inexhaustible in all directions. And his opposition to the use of the human rational faculty, or aql, is that it imposes a kind of delimitation on the Qur'an. And he reminds us that the word aql is related to the root which means to limit or to constrain. And so any speculative or rational attempt to understand the Qur'an is a false delimitation of its inexhaustibility. Okay. How much time? Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to jump at this point then to talk about the term that Ibn Arabi does prefer when he mentions the Qur'an. Just contemplate the ocean for a moment. So Ibn Arabi's preferred term for Quranic interpretation is Ishara, which means illusion or suggestion or indication. The term isn't unique to him, of course. It has wide usage in the Sufi tradition. Sufis sometimes refer to themselves as the Ahl al-Ashara, people of illusion. And it doesn't only pertain to Quranic interpretation. Nonetheless, it is used by Sufi authors, both before Ibn Arabi's time, right? Qushayri's Lataf al-Isharat, the subtle allusions, is the name of his commentary. The 18th century exegete Ibn Ajiba divides his interpretation of the Quran into its ibara and its ishara, right? Its expression and its indications. Now, when Ibn Arabi discusses his and other Sufis' use of this term ishara, He suggests that it is done largely to deflect criticism from the exoteric scholars, the ulama rusum, for whom he has a good deal of criticism. Nonetheless, he indicates that by referring to their more esoteric understandings of the Qur'an as isharat, the Sufis can helpfully avoid the kind of scrutiny that would come if they were to put these forward as their own interpretations, right? Or tafsir. Rather, they both understand and present it as a meaning that occurs or is suggested specifically to them as individuals. But this is not the only place where Ibn Arabi talks about the term ishara. He discusses ishara, for example, as a special capacity given to those saints who have committed themselves to remaining silent. As I discussed in a presentation at a previous Ibn Arabi Society conference, Ibn Arabi asserts that those saints who have practiced or taken a commitment to silence as a spiritual exercise are granted, by way of compensation, extraordinary powers of illusion, an ability to communicate all that they need without using words. And in that same paper, I note that he gives, as a paradigmatic case for such a saint, the Quranic figure of Maryam, the mother of Jesus. He mentions Maryam when he talks about Ishara in terms of the Qur'an as well. Right? And he notes that when Maryam brings the infant Jesus to her unexpecting family, she's taken, like these other saints, a commitment to remain silent. And so when she brings them to her in the face of their accusations, just like the Sufis, in the face of the accusations of the exoteric scholars, she doesn't speak, she just points to the infant Jesus in order to avoid blame. I would say that the idea of ishara, and I haven't found Ibn Arabi discussing it in this particular way, but the idea of illusion or ishara is a kind of barzakhi idea, right? So Ibn Arabi sees the whole world really in many ways as a series of barzakhs or barazikh, liminal points, right? That the contingent world is a barzakh between absolute existence and non-existence, or the imagination is a barzakh between abstract thought and sensory perception, and so on. Well, ishara also is that kind of a liminal concept, right? It's somewhere between speech and silence. Right? From the point of view of speech, ishara or pointing or indication seems like a silent move. But from the point of view of silence, it's a kind of speech, or at least a communication. Okay? But from the point of view of, but Ibn Arabi's invocation of the case of Maryam specifically, not only in relation to the saints, but also in relation to the Qur'an and Quranic interpretation, I think is particularly significant. Right? There we go. In the passage from the Qur'an, it says when she brings him to her people, then she pointed to him, asharat ilayhi, and they said, how shall we speak to one who is yet a child in the cradle? And he said, truly, I am a servant. He, being Jesus, said, truly, I am a servant of God. He has given me the book and made me a prophet. Now, when Maryam points to the infant Jesus, she's pointing to a child who has already been described in the Qur'an as the word of God, a word from him. Right? So what she's doing really in pointing, and she doesn't look like she's quite pointing in this picture. I apologize. I couldn't find one where there was an artist doing exactly what I wanted them to do. But when she points to the child, right, what she's doing is she's pointing back to the word itself. Right? She's pointing back to the word. And when the family says, how can we speak to a child in the cradle? They're not instructed as to how they can speak to a child in the cradle, because they're right, they can't. Instead, the child speaks to them. Right? So I think in using this term ishara, Ibn al-ʿArabi might also be giving us an ishara about the importance of fidelity to the literal meaning of the Qur'an. I think he suggests here that the highest purpose of interpretation, or ishara, is to point the reader back to the Quranic words themselves, to allow them to see for themselves, as Maryam's family did, the miraculous nature of God's word, to come to understand that while they may not be able to speak to the Qur'an, they might not be able to impose their own rational, discursive thoughts upon the Qur'an, they might come to witness, as Maryam's family did, the miraculous ability of God's word to speak to them in the most unexpected of ways.
Our next speaker is Mohammed Rustom, and he's talking on Ibn Arabi on translation.
How are all of you doing? Good. So I wanted to ask a question first before I begin, which is who here is a legal expert? No fuqaha in the crowd? Okay, right, exactly. That's why. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Please. Okay. Good. Yeah. Let's. All right. So right. Okay. This is. Can always count on him to say the right thing and do the right thing. All right. So. All right. So. So we're in a law faculty, so it makes sense that we talk about law, right? And in Islamic law, there's a tax every year that a person has to pay, kind of surplus, income, that kind of stuff. And it's, what is it known as? This is the first. This is a underhand kind of. What's that called? That tax? I guess it's translated as alms tax. What's it called in Arabic? What do we call it? What's the term in Arabic? Zakat. Okay, good. Zakat. So if you have a treasure, if you have something stored away, you have money, you have to kind of pay this treasure. You have to take from it, pay it out. It's not yours. Now, we heard about the hadith of the hidden treasure earlier. And if I were to tell you that according to a Sufi view, not from Ibn Arabi, but I can't see him disagreeing with it. If I was to tell you that God himself has to pay the zakat, what would you think of that? Because he has all the treasuries, right? He is the hidden treasure. So he has to distribute the zakat. Now, what does he have to pay? What does he pay? I'm hoping Amr can help me. We have to pay money, right? We have to pay money. Well, God's not going to pay money. Who's going to pay it to? But he has to distribute. He has to distribute. He has the treasure. He has to share what he has. What do you think?
Create something.
Yes, there's some externalization, right? And what this author tells us is that he says that God has to distribute mercy. That's the zakat on his hidden treasure. So pay attention to that. He also says that there's a distributor of this mercy. Who do you think that could be? Prophet, yeah. So he's the one who distributes the mercy. He's kind of like an intermediary between God and human beings. So keep in mind two things here. One, it's the question of intermediaries, because we're going to talk about translation. And then the other thing is the question of mercy. And what could mercy have to do with translation? Well, let's wait and see. Now, allow me to first begin with another set of observations. So secondly, these directly pertain in one way or another to everyone in this room, I'm assuming, and perhaps also those watching online, which I'm noticing is a very substantial number, mashallah. Now, we're invested in the act and art of translation, taking one of humanity's most profound and meaningful authors, Ibn Arabi, and explaining him in English, and this for the benefit of people. That's what I think we're all trying to do. Now, those who do this professionally recognize that there are formal requirements for such an undertaking, including, in case you want to get into this, mastery of Arabic, a thorough background in Islamic thought, intimate knowledge of the Qur'an and prophetic traditions, and deep familiarity with various fields of study in the Islamic tradition, such as grammar, legal theory, logic, cosmology, so on and so forth. Yet anyone who steps into Ibn Arabi's world becomes quickly aware that translating him is not simply a matter of philology and scholarship. There seems to be a kind of existential requirement that also informs his task. This requirement, I hope to suggest, becomes more apparent when we first come to terms with not only Ibn Arabi's complex worldview and language, but what emerges as his own theory of translation. In other words, we may have a lot to say about translating Ibn Arabi, but what does Ibn Arabi himself have to say about translation? Now, perhaps if we understand our situation as translators, in light of Ibn Arabi's understanding of translation, will we be in a better position to come to terms with what it is that he's trying to do as a translator and what we are doing as translators of his writings and as also readers of these translations. This applies to both the readers and the translators. Now, while my concern is with the details of Ibn Arabi's theory of translation, it can easily be argued that his perspective, or this perspective, informs the entire Sufi tradition both before and after him. This explains why in his book entitled Lawa'ih, or Gleams, Abdurrahman Jami, about whom we've already heard, who was, of course, a major follower of Ibn Arabi, he says, now I'm going to quote this saying, this is a translation from Professor Shirik. So it goes like this: the author has no share save the post of translator and no portion but the trade of speaker. Let me read that again. The author has no share save the post of translator and no portion but the trade of speaker. Whatever this theory of translation is, there is no doubt that Professors Shirik and Murata have embodied it in their own work, and not just in translating Ibn Arabi, but also in translating the works of many other masters in the Islamic tradition, be it Rumi and Samani in Persian, Farghani and Mullah Sadr in Arabic, and Lu Zhi and Wang Dayu in Chinese. Now, an exposition of Ibn Arabi's theory of translation thus has the added benefit of giving us a window into how this theory informs the translation practices and methods employed by our honored teachers, whom, it should be noted, their students lovingly refer to as, and this will be a revelation for some of you, the masters of the translators. We call them the Shuyukh al-Mutarjimin. So, okay. Now, as expected for Ibn Arabi, there are multiple levels to tarjama or translation. So it's never a simple matter with him. My focus here will specifically be on translation as it pertains to divine speech and words. The standard Arabic dictionaries tell us that a tarjuman, that is a translator or interpreter, is anyone who can clarify, mufassir, words or statements. It is in this sense that Ibn Abbas, the Prophet's cousin and master of Quranic interpretation, has the honorific title Tarjuman al-Quran, or clarifier of the Quran. The Prophet himself is often referred to as a tarjuman by Ibn Arabi, normally calling him the translator of the real, tarjuman al-haq, and this in the context of conveying God's words, but also in the context of conveying the hadith qudsis, the sacred sayings. Now, in fact, Ibn Arabi argues that the expression tarjuman al-haq, or translator of the real, applies more broadly to any being who conveys God's words, such as angels and even individuals who sing his praises. And of course, the expression applies to the friends of God, the awliya Allah, and hence Ibn Arabi is also a translator of the real, and this is why he refers to himself as a tarjuman in many of his own books. For example, in the Kitab al-Abadila, the Book of God's Servants, he calls himself a tarjuman, and many other such works like this. Now, what makes human beings translators of the real is ultimately the purity of their hearts. Since Ibn Arabi says, the tongue is a dalil or indicator of what is in the heart. So this is how he puts it. Look at how beautiful this is and how succinctly perfect it is. He says, the tongue is the translator of the heart. Al-lisan tarjuman al-janan. The tongue is the translator of the heart, and the heart is the hearer of the All-Merciful. And this calls to mind one of my favorite passages in Sufi literature, which goes back to the Persian Sufi philosopher Ain al-Quzar Hamadani, who died about 30 years before Ibn Arabi was born. Telling his students about the divine mysteries that are revealed to him, this is what he says. He tells them, you have not heard these, or the mystery, from my tongue. You have heard it from my heart. You have heard it from the spirit of Mustafa, the Prophet ﷺ, and whatever you have heard from the spirit of Mustafa, you have heard it from God. So it goes from God to the Prophet, to his heart, to his tongue and then to the ears of his listeners. Now let's go back to the Prophet as a translator of the real. Ibn Arabi insists that in conveying the Quran in particular, the Prophet is its translator in the deepest sense possible, although the speaker is God. The Prophet is specifically a translator in the sense of being a particular, delimited container for the word of God. Yet with respect to the Quran, as reciters, we are also translators. In chapter 68 of the Futuhat Meccan openings, which is on the mysteries of purity, Asrar Tahara, Ibn Arabi states there are two levels of purity required to approach the Quran. There's purity of the body, which is required to physically touch the Quran. And then there's purity of the heart, which is required to be touched by the Quran. So there's two kinds of purity required. And if you can do that, then of course you're able to effectively translate the meanings of the Quran. So this is a long passage, but I'll cite it for you because it drives the point home very well. He says, the Quran reciter is the deputy, na'ib, of the real in translating for him through the deputy's speech. One of the names of God is the All-Holy, Al-Quddus, which means pure. It is thus fitting for the servant that when he acts as the deputy of the real, in his speech and through his recitation, that he be holy, that is outwardly pure with the ablution as laid down in the Sharia. And it is fitting that the servant be inwardly pure with faith, presence, pondering, and the like, and that from the beginning the servant give priority to the recitation of the real and then follow it, acting as a translator of what the real recites to him and says to him. The Shaykh goes on to note that there are two kinds of translation involved when the Quran reciter acts as the deputy of the real. There is a kind of pre-verbal translation which allows the one present with the reciter to be reminded of the divine word through the state of the recitation itself. And then there is a translation proper, which comes through the speech of the Quran reciter and allows the one present to hear the word of God. Now, a key point to note is that translation is closely tied to transmission and the existential state of the one doing the translating. This is why the Shaykh also says that when the translator is conveying in appropriate language the meanings that come to him at that given moment, truthfulness and the absence of egoism and worldliness are essential. Otherwise, you can't be a good translator. That is to say, the meanings need to fit into proper linguistic forms in order for there to be a truthful translation. If one encounters meanings that cannot fit into linguistic forms properly, they are better left unsaid, even if the linguistic forms originally correspond to the meanings given to the translator. And when new meanings come, thus, and words are no longer capacious enough to contain them, the translator must remain silent or find more suitable expressions to translate these meanings. Now, a key insight in Islamic theology is that God is al-mutakallim, or the speaker. And God's being a speaking agent entails a cosmic picture in which all things are not only addressees of divine speech, but are themselves acts and embodiments of this speech. That is to say that God's speech in Islamic metaphysics has a self-reflexive aspect, and it also has a generative aspect. For Ibn Arabi in particular, all things in the cosmic order form so many individual parts of God's speech. They each arise within the breath of the All-Merciful, Nafas ar-Rahman, which is the divine creative breath which brought the cosmos into existence. Or framed differently, we can say that each thing in the cosmos constitutes a reverberation of the divine command, kun, be, which itself brought the cosmos into being. Seen as an articulated book, then the cosmos contains words that contain messages, which are then to be read, understood, and followed. Now, the most important Quranic verse that informs this perspective is Quran 41:53, which reads that we will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until they know that He is the real. سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ. Just as the Quran as a speech of God contains signs or ayat, so too does the cosmos as God's articulated speech contain signs. In other words, reading the signs as parts of God's speech is tantamount to translating them. There thus needs to be speech and hence words for translation to occur. And since the cosmos is nothing but divine words, our interaction with these words always entail translation. To be sure, the signs are also found in ourselves, which means that translation has both exterior and interior dimensions. Translation is as much about reading what is without as it is reading what is within. At the same time, translation for Ibn Arabi is not just an act of reading and conveying, it also entails careful and patient listening, specifically listening to the existentiating divine command, be. Proper listening will be obstructed by the all-deafening noise that exist throughout the cosmic order. But if people can rend these phenomenal veils and hear the eternal divine address, they will come to know and thus translate to themselves the divine mercy and compassion that pervades all things, both in this life and the next life. So I'm going to read this one passage from the Futuhat. Again, it's a little long, but he says it so well here. He says, the hearing needs to rend all causal veils until it hears the word be. God created the strength of faith in the believer. This power pervades his hearing, so he perceives the word be. Then this strength pervades his seeing, so he witnesses the engenderer of the causes. God does all of this from the breath of the All-Merciful, so that through it, he can be merciful towards whosoever worship other than him, when he exacts the rightful dues of the associates who declare themselves quit of him on the day of standing. We all stand up before God. Normally translated as the day of resurrection, but Professor Shiddick insists that it's not a resurrection, it's literally qiyamah, you stand up. It's much more concrete image. Now the act of translation, as reading, hearing, and conveying, is therefore a continuous process and fundamentally our existential situation. Since God never ceases speaking, we never cease translating. But not all translations are equal. This is where Ibn Arabi's insistence on the purity of the receptacle of divine speech comes in. Only by being pure and unsullied by distance from God can we properly convey suprasensory realities in delimited and particularized ways, thereby translating through forms the meanings that derive from the world of the formless. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, questions? Anyone? Raise your hand. Yes.
Dubois and Professor Rustom, you both reference the divine commands of be, and is this divine command be once, or is this something that is recreated or can be re-engaged with over and over?
Yeah, we haven't talked about that, but the creation is renewed at every moment. So the command be is always happening, as we understand through Ibn Arabi. Mohammed, do you want to add to that?
She's right.
Okay.
Time where even in the complete purity, God knows who is pure. And I fully understand what you said about beautiful ancient purity, and that's like obvious for most of us. But I was just wondering if you have any comments or anyone had any comments on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Ibn Arabi telling you yeah, so the term for purity here, tahara, right, which can refer to kind of ritual purity, like physical purity, but also, as he mentioned, internal purity. And then of course, there's another word, which is zakat, like from zakat, to purify your wealth, right? And there's a verse in the Quran, وَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنِ اتَّقَى. Don't declare yourselves pure. He knows, God knows who's the most God conscious. So no one, there's no like formal school where we can go find out who's more pure, right? But there's a kind of internal requirement which he lays out, which is that on one level you kind of do whatever you need to do to try to purify yourself as much as you can. So there are formal things, like in Ghazali's books and Qushairi, like in the earlier Sufi writing, they enumerate these, not being worldly, no anger, excessive lust. All these things have to kind of be put in their proper place, no envy, so on and so forth. So basic ethical requirements. And then even if one can do that, it's not up to them to become pure, right? There's another verse in the Quran which Ibn al-ʿArabi loves, and of course every Sufi author they draw on this because it points up the fact of the agent of purification so well. It says, speaking of the Quran, لا يمسه إلا المطهرون, right? None shall touch it. It's normally translated as none shall touch it as except those who are pure. But someone who's mutahhar is somebody who's been purified. So the agent of purification, God is the one doing the purification. It's such a passive kind of act. But the litmus test is, the extent to which one's own egoism creeps in. And human beings are very bad judges of one another, but we're all very good internally. If you pay attention, you know what's going on within, right? And so, Ibn al-Arabi emphasizes that, if you want to read the Quran, right, you have to kind of clean your ears out a little bit. And that's not right, to hear it, to read it, clean your eyes a little bit. And then it depends on God. But if you find yourself in the act of reading and therefore translating and even like reciting, kind of, interpreting as you're going along, then that's usually an indication that there's some selfish hidden desire. So one of my favorite examples of this in the Futuhat, because Ibn al-Arabi insists that he says, this book it's just coming from pure ilham, it's purely coming from another place, and I'm just writing down what's coming. Sometimes he'll when he gets to, especially in the sections on law, he'll put legal practices which have an order. He'll put them in the wrong order, right? And then he'll say, well, this section, the wudu section, should come before the prayer section, but it's not up to me. So in one or two instances, he quoted the Quran, and he actually makes a mistake. I don't want to even doesn't make mistakes, it comes to Arabic and Quran. He knows what he's talking about, but here it is, there's a mistake, and he doesn't go back and cross it out. He keeps the mistake in there, and then as he's writing, the next few lines are him asking God to forgive him for making the mistake. Because there's a human margin, right? There's still and then he just continues. So it actually lends a lot of support to what he's saying. So I hope that gives you some parameters to think about this question.
I can just my question. So I thought it was so beautiful how you started your lecture with God having zakat view upon him. If I could add a comment to that, Imam Ghazali in his chapter on zakat, he says there's 3 levels of zakat. He says there's the zakat of the common people, which is 2.5%. Then there's the zakat of the elect, and that's that they give as much as they can, but they hold on to the necessities that they feel they need to. And then he says there's the zakat of the elect, and they give everything away. And he mentioned the story of the Sufi. He was once asked by a man, how much zakat is due on me for 100 dirhams? And he says, for the common people, it's 5 dirhams, for us, it's everything.
Yeah.
So I think if we tie that into our idea of God having zakat upon him, and equating the zakat to mercy, God is stingy, and he only gives 2.5% of the mercy that's available. He gives it all. Everything.
Yeah. Oh, yes, yeah. No. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, right. When Solomon said this, the author who said that it's not even there, but I'm sure Ibn al-Arabi wouldn't have found that. And for example, was always a leader of Islam, so it makes sense. They're all part of some tradition. The idea that his point is that God, he has all the treasures of existence, right? And he must share himself, right? He loves to be recognized, right? And how can we recognize God? Through manifestation, as Amr just alluded to. And then, so what is manifestation entail? Because being able to see the signs, right? Look at the traces of God's mercy. So it's mercy really that's the indicator, right? That points us back. And that's everything. It's not 2.5. It's all that we, right? There's this famous hadith that says that in this world, we see 1/99 of all mercy of God, all love between the mother and the children, the love people show for one another and compassion, animals, and so on and so forth. And the 99 parts of the 100, the 99 parts are all for the afterlife. That's why in that passage of the reading, it says, God's going to exact the dues of everybody at the end. It's his compassion that always triumphs. And that's the whole of the affair.
Question the father and observation on others people posed to Dr. Marlene. So when you were explaining this beautiful verse of the Qur'an, Alast people about you rightfully placed a hadith prophetic saying attributed to the divine, or divinely inspired to prophetic saying. I was a hidden treasure. But have you ever come across mystical interpretations of this prophetic saying? Although conventional commentators, exegetes, and mufassirin and believe all of them reject this, they say they outrightly reject. They say it is mawdu', concocted, fabricated, or very weak narration. But most Sufi mystics have taken it seriously, but they translate it in different ways. Kuntu kanzam makhfun, I was the hidden treasure. So I loved not to be recognized, but I loved to be loved. Because marifat, recognition, realization leads to Muhammad. So the Sufis say, many Sufis, including Indian Sufis, they say فأحببت أن أحب. أحببت أن أحب. So I love to be loved, because recognition leads to. So have you ever come across this explanation in your study? I created the creations, and with this they realize, they recognize me, they love me.
Right. First, I have to say I have not. My exercise for this talk would be gather what some have said about the covenant of Alast, and I did not include variations when I was speaking. Variations about that hadith, the hadith of the hidden treasure. Is, of course, not among the sound hadiths that can be verified, as you said. Ibn al-ʿArabi often talks about certain hadiths that he'll say not sound on the basis of transmission, but sound on the basis of unveiling. So, there may be any number of those sorts of things going on. And then also, I should add that the two variations of the hadith, I love to be known and I desire to be known. That's the only two that I would have shared, speaking more on the topic. But that's very interesting, what you just shared. Thank you.
Over here. Yes.
So thank you. We've spoken a little bit about translation in spiritual terms and things like that. Yes. But I was interested in Ibn al-ʿArabi is someone who lived in multilingual contexts, and I'm wondering a little bit about what he thought about language. I mean, he obviously had a really important connection with Arabic, but I'm interested in his theory of translation as it actually relates to other languages in places of Cuba. Forgive me if it's out still.
No, that's thank you. We find so much and I find it really unraveled, but the main thing is that for him, language is everything. When it comes to Quranic interpretation, for example, right, more than any other author that I've seen, he basically says that if the Quranic verse, any interpretation that we give to it, if it's supported by the language, the Arabic language, then it's a valid interpretation. So just on a basic level of just, ta'wil or tafsir, he has this, it's a far-ranging view. There's light ambiguity too. Of course, he didn't know other languages, but sometimes people that he'll refer to like Hebrew or he'll refer to like a Coptic term, right? And he makes it very clear sometimes in some passages that he says, you have all these people, they, for example, speak about the Lord. In this language, they call him, he cites once, he says, they call him a creator, right? So like creator, right? And then in Hebrew, there's a term, Yahweh, and then of course in Arabic. And he goes, these are names, and there's some others, God, right? So his understanding of language relates to his theory of interpretation and also to his, just his basic view that humanity has. We've all been given this wonderful vehicle. And that again comes out of the Quran, right? Because the Quran speaks about the diversity of your languages, right? اختلاف ألسنتكم, right? The diversity of your language, all being signs of God. But it's much more complicated for him because it also relates to his cosmology. So the entire world and the whole cosmic order, it's related to the different manifestations of the Arabic alphabet. It's kind of the way he lays it out is he says that, because the universe comes about through the existential breath of God, right? So when you think about when we breathe, right? There's a constriction, right? And then so he says that constriction, that's kind of that mercy and love of the divine that wanted to come out, going back to the treasure. So then God, there's a kind of exhaling, and then through this breath of compassion, everything comes about. And one of the things that come about in breath is language. So words are formed not just through language, but through breathing. Because you need to be able to breathe in order for language to be articulated, right? And that relates to each of the stations of the Arabic alphabet, which is what it starts getting to. But the really interesting thing is if it's that breath of compassion, that there's a sigh of relief of this divine constriction. At the end, there's also the inhale, where God goes, because he goes like that, and then he goes, and everything comes back in, and it's all unfolded back into the divine. That's why everything returns back to the mercy of God. And that's also kind of prefigured in the Sufi Sama, where you have an exact motion, the outward breathing, and then the inward. So in doing that, there is a kind of prefigurement or reenacting of the divine creative processes that are involved in the film.
Has anybody made any link between the Quranic verse, فَعَلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ, Muhammad, therefore know that there is no one but God, to the independent of prayer and hadith? Has he made any link between them, between this Quranic verse and that hadith, to your knowledge?
Yes. Honorable read those during the 36 hadith section, right? I think the intro. So there is this in the Qur'an in chapter 198 in the Qur'an. So it's a really long, complicated, beautiful chapter. And in it, he goes through all 36 instances in which God declares La ilaha illallah in the Quran. And it's La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illahu, La ilaha illa ana, right? And then he takes you through every single, how it all relates to the Quran, and how it relates to a specific teaching that comes up with respect to the divine-human relationship. And he said that each of these declarations of La ilaha illallah, they always take place from the Nafs Rahman. That's why each section begins with, it's this verse, and it comes from the Nafs Rahman, right? From the breath of the All-Merciful. And I believe in one of those 36 that he does, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, he links it to the hadith that you were asking about. But if he does it there, perhaps he does it elsewhere. But it's kind of, very common in his writings. for him to link one Quranic verse to a hadith, and I think a very simple like little search, you could easily find it. But I'm pretty sure it's in there, section 198.
198.
Full-time, yeah. And I think Amr can clarify that for us. No.
Yes.
The story, obviously, regarding spiritual and wisdom, but also it offers, I guess, very important legal and legal dimensions to it too, like on everyday life, from like divorce to wills to interaction between people and finances. So I wanted to ask, like, to what extent does the Sufi approach that you all have been exploring, I wonder, like this idea that the limitations of akal, the dangers of the ego, the idea of who is pure is something only God knows. I wonder if you could hypothesize how much of that approach has kind of offered support to non-normative interpretation of like Islamic law and given kind of credence to those non-normative voices. I'm thinking like outside of the male religiously. Or do you think that kind of maintains the exclusivity, the idea that, who can understand or who can interpret something that is like a select few? And the first speaker also talked about, the Quran itself kind of offering this warning that, the idea of interpretation is something that encompasses layered. So, very long-winded question, but I'm wondering if you could offer any thoughts on how that approach, what it offers in the modern day to modern scholars in terms of in the interpretation field.
Well, I would say, well, first of all, I mean, for Ibn al-Arabi, as far as I read, and there are people here who know better than me, but I mean, the Sharia is also kind of non-negotiable for him. I mean, he's very clear, even when he talks about, for example, who would be, when he talks about interpreting the Quran, I can back up for a moment. And he said, those exoteric scholars, and when they say that the only way you can interpret the Quran is to learn from someone else, to learn from, they mean it to learn from earlier Muslims whose understandings of the Quran have been transmitted. And Ibn Arabi said, well, they're right, that you have to learn it from someone else, but they're wrong that you have to learn it from them. And he said, the person who you have to learn it from is God. And so in order to be able to God teach you what the Quran means, you have to have a kind of purification. And when he describes what that means, he doesn't just describe, esoteric spiritual practices. He talks about adhering to the Sharia. He says those people who can understand the Quran, who receive that divine understanding, they're the people who hold to all of the rules of the Sharia, who are sort of faithful to the Sharia. I want to be clear that he doesn't, sort of compromise on that. At the same time, he does talk about the fact that not only is there a kind of continuous creation, that there's no repetition in creation. At every moment, everything is created anew, and it's completely new, and it's completely different. It's the same with interpretations of the Quran, that God continuously unfolds his message across not only time, but also across human receptacles, so that over time, different understandings of the Quran may come out because the receptacles are different, because God is bringing out a meaning or unfolding or unveiling one of the meanings of that text that had never been seen before. So it is this notion, and as Professor Rustom was saying, the creation itself is a kind of, speech, right? God sort of breathing words
into existence, the same the Kun Fayakun that we talked about. And so, in this sense, a continuous unfolding of creation, a continuous unfolding of the being of the kind of be essentially the same thing. So it's not, new things can come forward, but there is also this idea that him, adhering to the principles of the Sharia are fundamental to getting to a point where you can live in understanding and where you want to God, you would say, have that purity to receive that understanding of God.
Available about Mariam pointing to eating Jesus. I know a lot of authors interpreted the word speaking by saying that, well, age-wise, he might have been a toddler, but that doesn't quite do it for most of the mystical explanations. So would you comment on what you feel or what other authors have said about this?
Well, I think it takes away everything because they thought it was a toddler instead of, I've never heard a toddler talk like that. So it doesn't seem that that's particularly a good explanation. But, of course, it's that particular passage is in the Surah Maryam. And the Surah itself has a lot to do with speech and silence. The story of Zechariah is also told there, and he is given word of the son. He asks for a sign that he won't be able to speak. So he's not only an old man, obviously capable of speaking, but he's a priest, so his vocation is to speak, and yet he can't. And then you have this child the infant, who should not be able to speak and does. So I think in part of the sort of straightforward interpretation is that this is, one of the mu'jizat, right? The sort of esoteric explanation. This is one of the demonstrative miracles that is performed by Jesus, like all the prophets are given these kinds of miracles to confirm their authority and the message that they bring from God. It's also understood as a mercy to Maryam. She has to completely, she's being accused of something for which at that time she could have been killed. And yet she's, told by God to maintain this act of silence. And so Jesus, in that sense, is her son, is her child, is her defense. She put the kind of absolute trust in that, because she couldn't even really defend herself because of this commitment that she had made, right, to silence.
But I'm getting more at the concept of the order.
Yeah.
Transmission of speech to violence.
Yeah, I'm getting there. So the word, there's in the Quran, there's kind of connection between the messengers and the message that they bring, right? Even in the context of the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad is, Alhamdulillah, means a mercy to the world, and so is the Quran. And so, but in the very particular case of Isa or of Jesus is described as a kalima, right, as a word from God. And the Quran does not really explain how Jesus receives the gospel as his revelation, the way that it describes the way. It intimates the way the Prophet Muhammad received the revelation, describes the way Moses received the revelation. It just says that Jesus was taught this. So in a sense, there's almost a kind of closer connection, you might say, an ambiguity between Jesus as the bringer of the word and Jesus as the word. But that makes Maryam, of course, the deliverer of the word. Right? She doesn't just point to the word; she brings the word into existence, which is why in some interpretations Maryam is likened to the Prophet Muhammad, right? It's a kind of pure vessel through which the word enters the world. But here, I think, she's also sort of pointing back to the word in that sense, right? Her job is, first of all, to bring the word into the world, but then also to focus people's attention back on it.
Could you use your microphone when you ask the question? Yes.
Yes, thank you for Professor Rustom. Regarding the Islamic of Ibn al-ʿArabi, and is there any study on like what percentage is like original Islam, language that he invents, and also we can speak on how other scholars after Ibn al-ʿArabi they advance this terminology and produce meanings like Arabi, etc.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so there are two questions. They're kind of different. I think that if I understood the first question, do you mean like in his writings, how much of the stuff that he comes up with is original to him? Is that what you're asking?
The terminologies that he uses.
Oh, the terminology. Yeah.
How much of it is original from him?
Yeah. So that's like often when people encounter an Arabic first time, if they don't know the Sufi tradition that preceded them, they think it's already unique to him. Wow, look at an Arabic, look at this new word that he's using here. Wow, look at every single term like that. And look in the Quran, oh, it's not there. Oh, it's with him. But as we know, he was such a careful reader of the entire Sufi tradition before him. When he was a young man, he used to read Imam Bashiri the Sala, the fundamental of Sufism, so much that he earned the nickname Bashiri. And there was parts of the book have the basic structure of Bashiri the Sala. And he often will, cite early Sufi authors. Whenever he weighs in on an issue, he'll take you through what the legal scholars say, he'll take you through what the popular opinion is, maybe what some Hazilites say, some Ash'arites who he doesn't respect all that much what they say. And then also he'll go through many Sufi interpretations. This is very, very common. And that specific link between Ibn Arabi's terminology, the earlier tradition, it's been highlighted in contemporary scholarship. In French, Eddie Brill has done some work in Ishara, Michel Hortefeux, of course, French and Morse. But perhaps the most recent stuff that connects the Ibn Arabi to the earlier tradition in a way that's not been highlighted before is the work of Al-Tafwid, who's right there in the back. He's written a number of studies looking at the virtues in Sufi ethics, repentance, trust in God, contentment, so on and so forth, gratitude, and how it's used by early Sufi authors, how Ibn Arabi's in direct conversation with them, and then how Ibn Arabi, after having exhausted all the possibilities, then enters into his own worlds. Any term that you can think of will always give you a very unique interpretation of it, but not until he's weighed in and shown his indebtedness to the entire tradition for him. As for Ibn Arabi in the later tradition, he was received, many authors, everyone who came after him had something to say about him one way or another. And this is not documented so well in terms of Ibn Arabi's influence in Central Asia, South Asia, let's say Turkey, most of the Ottoman Empire. Some scholarship in Ibn Arabi's reception in certain quarters amongst Arabic authors. So I'm finish most specifically in a book that he wrote 30 years ago called Ibn Arabi, the later Islamic tradition at the time. But the authors who came after him had a stake in interpreting him, explaining him away, declaring him a heretic or whatever, because of some other intellectual project that they may be engaged in, right? Depends on what they were trying to do. Certain Shia authors, for example, used Ibn Arabi when it suited their purposes. Sometimes they saw in him a perfect mirror for what they were trying to do. As in the case of Heyman, he really respected Ibn Arabi a lot, but nevertheless disagreed with him on certain key issues, especially on matters where Shia creed was kind of contradicted. Ibn Arabi was ultimately he was a Sunni author, so but I'm engaged with him is incredible, and that's not religion studied that well actually. There's some scholarship has been done there, particularly by Nicholas Boylston at Harvard and a couple of other people. But that's something that really needs to be explored much greater detail. I mean, most recently, Arjun Nair has written a piece that looks at some of the Karjoo-Ravary in Arabi. But what's interesting for me is the extent to which the Futuhat was read by the later tradition. The Arabi wrote many books. The Futuhat has the most comprehensive of them, and it's also the most difficult to read because it's just so huge. And it's the one that he puts the most emphasis on amongst all of his writings. He read it publicly several times. He came up with a second edition of it before he died. But the later tradition, they tended to focus on smaller works of the Arabi, especially the Fusuh. There's over 100 commentaries on the Fusuh. But as Professor Chin pointed out many years ago, there are some chapters in the Futuhat that are larger than the whole Fusuh. So the later tradition kind of was reading Ibn al-ʿArabi in one particular way. It's not to say that it was wrong or anything. It's just, when you approach it through the lens of the Fusuh, you end up entering the very abstract philosophical territory very quickly. And the emphasis has always been amongst the readers of Ibn al-ʿArabi, even though they weren't commenting on it. It was the Futuhat where diving into the ocean of the Qur'an. And there were very limited, few expositions of Ibn al-Arabi's Futuhat in the tradition. And that's something that I think needs to be done more as we push to exploring that more. Just to give you an idea in terms of embeddedness, when it comes to the Quran, when Ibn al-ʿArabi passed the fatwa to burn the Futuhat, he looked through it and he found that there was so much Quran that he couldn't burn it. I mean, it's not only the translation of the Quran, so to speak, and commentary of the Quran, it is in many ways an articulation of the Quran, using the language of the Quran.
This is for Professor Dakake. Can you expand a bit more on what type of an exegesis is implied in Ishara? I'm thinking of, for example, the proverb Al-Aqilu Yaqidi al-Ishara, that for an intelligent person, an indication suffices. So is this sort of an indirect exegesis where you turn yourself to the Quran and there's something that's a mixture of a cognitive and body exegesis going on, because you also talked about the body of the baby as the word of God, but also Ashara ilay. She did exegesis with her head, in a sense. So I'm just wondering if you could really flesh out what is implied in Ishara being a modality of exegesis.
Well, I think the term, as Ibn al-ʿArabi talks about it, in the place where he talks about it most extensively, he talks about it as, primarily as a deflection, right? A deflection of criticism. But I do think it's more than that. I think it's more than that, kind of, of course, for other students as well. So the Ishara is something where you get an indication of something without explicit words, right? And so gesture, right? The pointing is a particular kind of embodied way of doing that. So I think there are a couple of things that are implied. One is the idea that that this is an individual kind of interpretation or an individual understanding. And he alludes to that as well, that one of the ways this is a deflection, but really also true, is that you're saying, I'm not saying that this is the tafsir of this verse. I'm just saying that when I read this verse, this is what occurs to me, right? This is what arises in me. But he would say it's not from it's not from the aql, right? It's not from the nas, which would be, a kind of waswasa or something, right? A kind of internal thing. But he talks about Ishara as coming to the heart. And like Ghazali, like many other people, they talk about the idea that real knowledge real understanding is a light that God casts into the heart. And he said that even a person who reads the Qur'an, if they read the same thing twice and they understand it the same way, they've done something wrong. Or they're not understanding. In other words, he talks about the idea that all have to do with constraining and fixing and restraining. And so applying logic to something is a way of pinning it down and causing it to, the same idea to be established over and over again, let's say in relation to a particular Quran verse. But the heart is the cloud, which is related to the word to turn or to change. And so in a sense, the heart is always changing. And so it's always receiving, as it reads the literal word of the Quran, it's always receiving a kind of Ishara understanding of it that's different at every moment.
Perhaps a question that doesn't have any good answer, but I'm just curious if you have any intuitions or gut feelings. Ibn Arabi's approach to the Quran is so very invested in ignoring the accumulation of received interpretations from the ancestral traditions, scholarly traditions, and taking each and every word back to its roots, its original root meaning, and exploring the fertile possibilities there. One might expect him to do the same with a word like tafwid, which you pointed out has this meaning of going back to the roots. In a way, it seems like a perfect fit, as Amin Quran, sort of suggested, problematically. But why do you think Ibn Arabi didn't make that move? Why in this specific concept or notion does he most of the time stick with the received sense of what tafwid means, this rational approach to interpretation, rather than trying to re-envision it as he does with such a dizzying plethora of other words?
I don't have an answer to that question. When I started, I was really looking for an answer to that question. But I turn this off. One of the things that one possible answer perhaps could just be a kind of very pedestrian answer from the point of view of where Ibn Arabi is coming from and his influences, right? He attends the funeral of Ibn Rushd about this idea of sort of Aqli interpretation of the Quran. So maybe he sort of sees himself as, trying to respond very directly to that particular type of view. But the other possibility, I think, is that there's Tawhid itself is idea sort of coming back to the origin, even though, as Rustom said, there is always a return to that mercy. So much of when he talks about the Quran, or when many things he said about the Quran, there's always this idea of a continuous unfolding, and on the repetitive, continuous recreation. And so Tawhid, in the sense of sort of coming back, it, ponders the idea of an unfolding that eventually returns to a kind of original point. And perhaps that is what he wanted to emphasize. To say that a meaning comes back to its original point is to always leave open the temptation that someone feels they've reached that point. And so I think he was trying to push people to say, you're not even anywhere close to expanding. I think maybe in light of the things that had come before, this is what he wanted to emphasize by conscience. Yes, you should leave it on the question.
I just to follow up with previous comment.
not the definitive answer here, but just based on my experience, it seems that Sheikh Akbar tends to go to the linguistic route when there is not a hadith or a Quranic confirmed description. So ultimately, he says, let's see, first of all, in my experience, I feel like he's saying, let's see how the divine speaker uses and describes what it is. And then we'll see how Arabic speakers will do, because there'll be a range of them there perhaps. But if it's been fixed by the divine speaker, then that's usually good enough for the Shaykh. And that's the place where it developed from. So just generally speaking, so other terms which are kind of confusing, what is fist and things like that, which are not explained, that's where he tends to go to the root. So nur, what is nur? Like it's related to nar, and it relates to, being running away from something. So, it displays darkness. But for me, Shankar is part of this method that Quran trumps and Hadith trumps just Arabic speakers. And then we can go and look at the language, but it's not just going into language of dictionary first.
Yeah. No, I would, I just wanted to say part of the actually that I didn't actually get to what's to do with, because, and I've written about this previously, but when you look at how it is used in the Quran, the term is used 17 times in the Quran, and in all of those 17 places, you could translate, or not a translation, you could translate the word ta'wil as interpretation, and it would make sense. But if you go to the 17 places and you translate ta'wil as the ultimate realization of something, which is one of the ways that you talk about ta'wil, that also makes grammatical sense in all of those places. And if you just take sort of the paradigmatic case of the story of Joseph, where he has the dream at the beginning of the 11 stars and the sun and Baghdad, he has an unarticulated, but we can all imagine what his interpretation of the dream was at that moment, which is, absolutely a special relation to my brother. This is the true interpretation. This is correct. But it's only at the end of his life when his brothers come back to Egypt and his father realizes who he is, and they actually do bow down to him. And he says, this is the ta'wil of my dream. And so it's, in a sense, we think of ta'wil as going from the literal meaning to the symbolic meaning. But in the story of Joseph, it goes the other way around. Right? It starts with the symbolic meaning and it goes to the literal meaning. And so I think there's a way in which the Quranic use of ta'wil is about how the meaning of the words can sort of unfold the meaning, even towards concretization or literal realization over time. There's kind of horizontal, vertical element that I was frankly surprised that Ibn al-ʿArabi, at least in what I read, and we've heard about how huge the hat is, it does not seem to engage that idea of continuous unfolding that I think you can make an argument for the basis of the literal usage of the term ta'wil.
Just a comment. So thank you. So if you actually criticize it for that, this isn't the ta'wil, this isn't the thing from true. Basically said this life is a dream. So he said, when this happens to you, you're still dreaming. Yeah. So he actually objects to this particular way of doing the ta'wil. I had this dream, then it came true at the end of my life. He said, no. You had a dream, then it corresponded to something in another dream. That's not the ta'wil of it coming true. The ta'wil of it coming true is when it is in the dream. Yeah. We were talking about hidden treasures and treasure. Ibn al-ʿArabi is specific and objects in a number of places to this wording. He prefers centering around the Quran. unrecognized treasure. So how's God hidden? It's a Zahir. What's hiding God? Who's God hiding from? Right, so he uses the word in Lamora and makes it a big deal in several places that it's not hidden, it's unrecognized treasure.
I think maybe that's for someone else to comment. Let me just quickly thank you for pointing that out. And that might be kind of part of the answer to this as well, is that there isn't a conclusive outwheel. Right? And in a sense, that's what, that's what that opening verse, whoever claims it's outwheel. In other words, whoever claims interpreted closure, whoever claims that it's finally done, we finally realized it. This is the real, fitna in that sense.
To be continued. Thank you so much, everyone. The next panel starts in 15 minutes. Thank you.